Hello, and welcome back to Forgeborn Hobbies. In this video, I'll show you how I painted the Necron half of the Warhammer 40,000 9th edition Indomitus box set. This army of 36 models totals around 1,000 points on the table, and I finished it in just 4 evenings of painting over the course of a long weekend. I took this army on as a challenge to see if I could finish the project in a weekend, and I learned a few things along the way that might help you out as well. I'm excited to show you how I got this done in such a short amount of time, so let's get painting. For the color scheme on this army, I had a couple of things I wanted and needed from it. First, it had to be a color scheme I could apply easily, which meant using Citadel contrast paints, as I needed to be able to spend as little time as possible on each model in order to keep a good pace going. Second, it had to be a color scheme that I don't see often, because I want these to stand out and be interesting on the table. And lastly, I needed a color scheme that could easily distinguish leaders and important models from the battle line units, without wasting time doing too many extra details. What I ended up with is a primarily crimson red scheme, with a dark teal on the weapons and other living metal surfaces, and a purple glow on the weapons, eyes, and power nodes. On the characters, I decided to use gold as a detail color. Gold can be easily shaded alongside the red, and Citadel's Retributor Armor Gold covers really well in only 1 or 2 coats. I decided that for this dynasty, the higher a Necron is in the hierarchy, the more gold they have on them and the less red. Maybe the red represents a lesser material, and the overlords of this dynasty can't stand the thought of anything of their own being of inferior quality, so they have none of it on them, instead replacing it with gold. This let me create a visual hierarchy in the army. The Overlord and the Skorpek Lord have a lot of gold and no red. The Royal Warden and the Plasmancer, who are lieutenants and advisors to the lords, have a little bit of red and some gold, and then everything else has a lot of red and absolutely no gold. The purple glow and the dark teal weapons help tie all of the models into the same force under a unified theme, making everything look cohesive even with these variations. With the plan laid out, it's time to get started. To prepare these models, they were cleaned, assembled, and based with my own mix of Mod Podge and fine modeling sand. I then primed them with Vallejo Surface Primer Black and made sure to get a good even coverage, which is really easy to do with an airbrush. Next, I base coated every model with Citadel Wraithbone, which I also used through an airbrush. The hard part of airbrushing with standard paints is that there's a very fine balance between being too thin, which makes the paint too runny and it doesn't cover very well, and being too thick, which makes the airbrush nozzle clog up and you have to clean it more often. Finding the right balance takes some practice and wastes a lot of paint, but can save time over hand painting every model in a project like this. To create some natural shading for later on, I only base coated about 75% of each model, leaving the lower 25% as the black primer. It will be barely noticeable later on, but it does help if you look close enough. Doing this also saved about 25% of the time it would have otherwise taken to get the base coating done, and it allowed me to ignore the deeper recesses and get through this whole part of the process a lot quicker. With the Wraithbone done, I went in with a large brush and started base coating the areas that I want to be glowing purple later on with Citadel Corax White. For this color I focused on the blades on the Overlord, Skorpek Lord, Plasmancer, and Skorpek Destroyers. I also used it on all of the orbs and crystals, including those that were set into the sockets, on the bodies of the Reanimator, the Scarabs, Plasmacite, and Cryptothralls. Lastly, I used it on the barrels of all of the ranged weapons. I thought it would look better to have the entire barrel glow instead of just the little nodes, like everyone else does theirs. It just let me have more coverage of the purple glow on the Warriors and the Warden, and I think it turned out pretty well later on. Doing a quick base coat of this now helped me block out these areas so that I can start to separate the different parts of the model, and even though I would have to clean this up later and redo the base coat, it really does help to have that initial base coat down now and just see where everything's at. With all the undercoats done, it was time to get actual colors onto these models. I started with getting the teal done using Citadel Pterodon Turquoise Contrast. Normally when you paint with Citadel Contrast, You want to do all of the lighter colors first because the darker colors can more easily cover the lighter ones and cover up any mistakes that you make. However, here I went with my gut and I did the areas that were harder to reach first, which included the weapons, the joints, and all of the other mechanical bits that hang off of these models. These tend to be towards the middle of the sculpts on Necron models, which meant that later on I was much less likely to bump into them with the brush while I was applying other colors. For this particular color on these models, I went with 2 coats of the contrast paint and applied it straight from the pot, only using the palette to control the amount of paint that was loaded in the brush. 2 coats gives a much darker color, but still leaves a great highlight in the edges that look great on their own, but will look even better when I get back around to doing finer highlights later. And with that, the teal's done. And once the teal was completely dry, it was time to do the red bodies. For this, I went back and tidied up a little bit with Wraithbone before using Citadel Flesh Terror's Red contrast paint. Flesh Terror's Red is one of my favorite colors in the contrast line, and I'm so glad I picked it as the primary color on this army. I was a little worried that the red next to the teal would look a little bit too Christmassy, but when it dried, I think the difference in tone between the warm red and the cool teal, as well as the darkness of the teal, looks pretty good next to each other. And when I go back and work on the highlights later, I can adjust how the colors read next to each other anyway, so if it still looks off, I can fix it. With the 2 main colors of the bodies done, I decided to work on the bases. Most of the bases are just my homemade basing mix, which I touched up the base coating with Wraithbone before moving on to painting each part in a different color. For most of the base, I used Citadel Wildwood Contrast, which covered all of the standard earth tones, which is on every model. And then wherever there were rocks and stones, I used Citadel Agaros Dunes Contrast. For any bones or skulls, I used Citadel Skeleton Horde Contrast. And then on some of the models where they have some other decor, like the giant power fist or the broken girder on the reanimator's base, I used Citadel Ioned Yellow Contrast, and then painted the girder and anything else that I wanted to be metal with Citadel Ironbreaker. I will say that I'm not a fan of the yellow bits on the reanimator's base, just because they look a little bit too much like the rocks around them, so I'm probably going to go back and repaint them blue later. I happen to have a friend who plays Ultramarines, so that will be a little bit of a troll for him if we do face off on the table with these armies. The gold, as I mentioned earlier, was done with just a couple of coats of Citadel Retributor armor. This is a fantastic gold base paint that can be pushed towards a bright, shining gold, or pushed to a dingy, aged gold, or even made to look like old bronze, with just choosing how to shade it and highlight it later on. I'll end up pushing this more towards an aged, weathered gold later, which I think fits well with the Necron lore. At this point, the majority of the model is nearly done. Something I like to plan into my projects is doing an all-over shade. If you've seen my videos on painting the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, I made a custom wash with contrast paints to shade all of the recesses and tie the colors together in one step. For the Necron, I decided not to use a custom mix, and instead I used Citadel Agrax Earthshade as a wash over the entire model, which included the red, the teal, the gold, and everything on the bases. This step helps to add depth to all the colors, while also shading the recesses and giving the model an overall aged and weathered look without going too crazy on it. This took a long time to dry, so when I do things like this, I try to plan on doing it and then doing something unrelated to hobbying. The hour or two it can take for a heavy wash to dry is a great time to take care of chores, get some exercise, eat a meal, or do what I did and actually play a game of Warhammer. And if those things take longer than an hour or two, it's fine. The important thing is that these models are bone dry before we handle them again. And once they were dry, I moved on to rebase coating with Citadel Corax White. This again went on anything that I wanted to have a glow effect later, including the weapon barrels, blades, gems, power nodes, and all of the eyes. Something I tried on these models that I kind of regret is that I intentionally used a larger brush to paint this color on. I let myself be a little bit less than careful, and I let the white paint hit areas around what I was aiming for, which I thought would create a really easy object source lighting effect, but it ended up just looking really sloppy and gross. So when I go back and keep working on these models later, I'm either going to clean up those areas and paint them the color they're supposed to be and go for just a cleaner look, or I'll use an airbrush to actually properly do the lighting effect that I'm going for here. Either way, once the white was done, I decided to try out something different with the blades. I wanted the gradient effect that you may have seen on the box art for the Necron, or may have seen from other YouTube tutorials, that really gives a cool sci-fi glow effect where it looks like the light is shimmering across the blade. But I decided to do it the lazy way. So my version of this was to use Citadel Basilicanum Gray contrast and use a lot of control, feathering, wet and dry brushes to create areas where the white of the blade transitions into a dark gray. This required pushing the contrast paint around, spending a lot of time cleaning up, feathering things out. It was a lot of work. And I don't think it turned out the way that I really pictured it, but I think it works for what I was going for, and it was definitely a lot quicker than doing layers and layers and layers of other things and going back and forth trying to get this effect. When the gray was completely dry, I went back and I used a thick coat of Citadel Magos Purple contrast. This paint is a little bit weird for a contrast paint because even a thick coat doesn't really cover as well or look as vibrant as other contrast paints. I'm not sure if it's just the pot that I had or if it's that color in general. Just doesn't cover very well. It certainly wasn't what I was expecting, and I think I may have to either do a lot more highlighting than I was expecting on this. However, if I can get it right, it will give a great glowing purple effect that stands out against the other colors and will give the army a really sinister alien vibe, which is what I'm going for. Finally, to finish off these models, I painted the edge of the bases with a couple coats of Citadel Abaddon Black, which is my go-to color for all of my base rims to make my whole collection of models look succinct, even if I do the rest of the base or the models differently. Something I would normally do is varnish these models with a matte varnish to protect them from use and to even out all of the finishes so that they look right, but since these aren't technically done yet, I held off on doing this, which means that for right now, these Necron are done. And there you have it, 1,000 points of Necron, made up of the contents of the Indomitus box set, painted in just 4 days to a tabletop, battle-ready standard. These will look great on the table, and if I add more to the army later, I know I can quickly build up the collection while still having models that look cohesive together. At some point, I do plan to go back and do some highlighting on all of the colors and introduce at least one new color to the scheme, probably in the form of silver on the cables and some of the more mechanical parts, just so they stand out from everything else and look like a different material. In the meantime though, I do hope you enjoyed this video and found this to be helpful in some way. If you liked it, please hit the like button, and if you want to stay up to date with future videos, make sure you subscribe. If you know someone who might benefit from this video, please share it with them and help get the word out. I do these videos for free right now, so any exposure I can get will be really greatly appreciated. Anyways, that's all I have for now. I hope you have a great day, stay safe, and keep painting.